Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Alex and I am a nomadic online business manager, and I help you streamline your operations so you can manage your business from anywhere in the world. And today we're going to be talking about the 4 different phases to manage a project. So when you're managing your projects, you want to make sure you have these 4 phases to help you make sure you hit every deadline, every task, as well as making sure your business doesn't get cluttered or lost in all of the other projects going on in your business. So let's dive into those 4 phases. Phase 1 is prepare. This phase is when you're figuring out what you need to do. This is the project planning phase. This is the phase where you're identifying the tasks that need to be done, identifying when those tasks need to be done, figuring out people's workloads to see if it's a realistic timeline for them to even complete in the first place, collecting all that information for the tasks to be completed, and just getting yourself organized and prepared. That's why it's called, they don't call it prepared for nothing. One tip I strongly recommend doing if you're working with a team is to have some sort of referenceable project brief that summarizes the general goal for the project. What are you working towards? What is the intended purpose and the intended outcome of this project? That gets everyone on the same page from the very beginning. If you're working remotely, you can do this either on a live call, if you do like weekly or monthly calls with your team. You can also do a Loom video where you send a Loom video to your Slack channel and where you can say, hey, this is an upcoming project. Make sure you like leave an emoji or something to make sure you've watched this video. Like have some sort of accountability piece so you know people have seen it. Not to like micromanage, but just to confirm, to have those visual confirmations to make sure everyone's on the same page. And with each of these phases, I recommend having a milestone to mark when you've completed that phase and when you're ready to move on to the next one. For phase 1, the milestone to mark completion is sharing with your team the project brief. However you're doing that, whether that's through a Loom video, whether that's through a weekly meeting, that's when you know that the team is ready to move on to the second phase. And the second phase is execute. So this is when you or your team are executing the tasks you built out in the prepare phase. This is probably what you are thinking of when you complete like any kind of project. These are most of the tasks people think of when they think of a project plan, where you're building out sales pages, you're setting up the tech, you're designing the graphics, you're building all of the assets that you identified that you need in the prepare phase. The milestone for completion for this second phase is sending it to whoever the final approval, whether that's your client, whether that's the CEO, for approval. It's sending it off for the first phase of review. Now, this is helpful because then it can allow space for feedback. It allows you to go back and edit things as needed. Even if it's just to yourself, managing yourself, it is helpful to kind of go through these phases mentally so then you can, one, be prepared for when you're outsourcing. It allows you to assess your project from a different standpoint, right? So like when you're in phase 2 where you're executing and you're building out those assets, you're working as the employee. And then that leads you into the third phase, which is review. That is when you're implementing feedback from your client if the project is a client project, and if it's just for yourself, then you're reviewing it as if someone else did it. So of course, I'm assuming that in the example before, you have a team that will help you prepare all of these assets. But if you're just still a solopreneur and you're still working on building everything out yourself, this is when you kind of shift eyes on your project and you want to look at it from like a critical, like, okay, let me act like this is the work of an employee or of a contractor that has completed this task for me. And how can I review and see what needs to be done still? And then the milestone to mark completion for the third phase is receive client approval. If that's just you working on your own project, it's receive CEO approval. Approved, right? If it's just you working by yourself, you can approve yourself. But this is where you get all of the approved assets completed. And this is where you might think that the project is done, but it's not. This is where people can get lost in terms of implementing the next project or keeping their business up to date in terms of like their project management tools. You want to make sure you have all of these things up to date, which leads us into the 4th phase, which is wrap up. The wrap up phase is where you handle all of those leftover bits and bobs of tasks that you don't typically remember to do. right? So this is the things like archiving task projects, making sure everything is actually completed. So you'll comb through the project plan and make sure everything is actually completed. You'll do this kind of throughout the project, but this is especially essential in the very end, just to make sure nothing falls through the cracks, right? And ideally you'll kind of do this through each individual phase just to make sure you're not letting things fall through the cracks in general in your business. So that's just like a general project management tip when managing tasks in your business, but especially at this phase, because this is where you clean things up. Essentially, you'll archive the list, you'll make sure again to delete all the test things, you'll update any naming conventions and any like stored assets anywhere if you have naming conventions for things. How I want you to think about this is the closing shift for your job. Like if you worked at a restaurant, for example. So this is when you're sweeping the floors, this is when you're restocking the ketchups and the mustards and all of that. Like you're getting all that stuff that you don't really think about when you're actually working, but they do still need to be done. Another thing that we want to make sure we're doing during this wrap-up stage is make sure you have a task for updating your SOPs. You might not need to do this if the project went smoothly and you have everything set, you're good to go, but usually something will come up where you need to update an SOP or workflow to make sure it's documented so you remember that for the next time. And the milestone for this fourth phase is archiving the list in ClickUp. Of course, I'm recommending ClickUp. That's always what I recommend in terms of project management tools, but whatever project management tool you're using, just make sure you archive that list. If you can't archive it, switch to ClickUp because you want to make sure you can have access to things, but you don't want it to clutter your project management space, because if you've already completed it, you don't need to look at it anymore. So, and to go along with that closing down the restaurant shift mentality analogy, that's when you're locking the door. Archiving the list is when you lock the door at the end of the day. Now, those are the 4 phases for managing a project inside of ClickUp or otherwise. In ClickUp, how I recommend organizing this is creating a custom field where you can list out each individual phase, and then you can assign each task to their phase and then group them by that phase. It allows you to get a good bird's eye view over everything, so then you can see like, okay, what actually needs to be done during each phase, and then you can have the task type change to milestone instead of a regular task. So yeah, those are the 4 phases for managing a project effectively and efficiently inside of ClickUp or beyond. If you have any additional questions when it comes to project management inside of ClickUp or any in general questions, make sure you leave those in the comments below, and make sure you like and subscribe to my channel for new videos every week. Bye!